What's up, all you spooky ghouls? This is everyone here at the Midwest Spook-kast. You got me, Mariah. You've got Alex.
Hello.
And you've got Kayla.
Hey, what's up?
And somewhere in his house, we've got Johnny making all of the edits to this. We love Johnny's work that he does. So, Kayla's got an extra special episode for us today on the Hiawatha Asylum in Canton, South Dakota. So we will pass it over to her and her very special guest.
Before we get started, Mariah, I have another special guest to introduce. So here at the Midwest Spook-kast, we will have a future little podcaster. So I'm pregnant, about 16 weeks pregnant. That's a great time.
I'm pregnant.
I'm pregnant. Alright, so this episode that we're focusing on today is over the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum out of Canton, South Dakota. We decided to focus on this one as living in South Dakota, you listen to people and you ask them about the history of South Dakota when it comes to the Native Americans. And this location actually isn't that well known. I actually had no clue it existed till randomly one day I was searching dark history of South Dakota, and this was number one. And I went, oh my god, I've never even heard of this. And it was really sad because when I watched a Keloland episode over it, a lot of them also had never heard of it. So it made me go, what happened in our history that we forgot about this? So, to kind of get started, so before I even talk about the episode, I want you guys, for anyone that's a World War II history buff like I am, I want you to think of the Nazi regime in Germany and their leader, Hitler. So a lot of them know about how he followed eugenics. A lot of what he learned about eugenics, he learned from the United States in our asylums. So a lot of his beliefs, he thought that we were doing something right. So that's pretty tragic that Hitler's looking at us going, that's good.
You know you're doing something wrong when Hitler thinks you're doing the right thing.
And that was the shocking part, because and he really paid attention to what happened in Canton. Because, as we know, Hitler targeted Jewish people, and as we learned with the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum, this was one of two locations that was created specific to Native Americans.
So you're telling me Hitler knew where Canton, South Dakota was?
Yeah.
If you know Canton, South Dakota, it's a small town.
It is.
So it's kind of interesting to think that like someone over in Germany can tell you exactly where Canton is and what is in Canton.
Hitler of all people.
Hitler of all people.
Dang, and he thought it was something good. How messed up.
Oh, yeah.
So I found that note to be really interesting, not in a good way. So I titled this episode A Dark History Unveiled, South Dakota's Indian Insane Asylum, just because our history is dark here in South Dakota. We have so many stories that are often, I guess you could say, whitewashed, where we try to make it seem less than what it was, because we don't want to think negatively about our history, when the downfall is history throughout the world is messed up.
So I had to take a Native American studies to become a teacher here in South Dakota, and let me tell you the lessons you learn from that class on what happened here in South Dakota with our natives.
So renaming this episode to South Dakota, one messed up place.
Yeah.
One of the messed up places.
Oh,
everywhere's messed up.
Valid. Alright, so we often look at history with rose-colored lens, a world unknown to us yet so well known, but we often sugarcoat it and reminisce on a history that often is dark and horrifying. In the 1800s and 1900s, the world of insane asylums was something common in the United States. And of course in the world too. This was commonplace in Great Britain, all over Europe. It wasn't just a American ideal. And it was a place that you would dump your family at. There's cases where husbands would dump their wives there because they were ready to move on with their lives. And just thought, I don't need the wife no more. I'm going to go find me a new wife. Or they would dump their children there. They would dump grandpa and grandma there. They would dump anyone there. Simply because they didn't want to deal with them. And if they were deemed mentally ill, perfect, you were there. So, the downfall with the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum is that it was a place to further indoctrinate and destroy a people simply for existing outside of the white culture at that time. So, if anyone knows about the boarding schools, we also had them here in South Dakota. And if you did not cooperate with the boarding schools, or you did not cooperate on the reservation, there's a good chance you could end up at this location. So, I'm curious. I got a question for you guys. What do you think of when you hear insane asylum?
Nothing good.
I think of the Hollywood version of it where, it's the guy with a straight jacket on, and he's kind of muttering to himself, and the guard just says, get in the pillowy room.
Oh.
Like that kind of thing. But I also know that's not exactly accurate.
Right. And you got a good point there, because I actually watched a documentary a while back that talked about the insane asylums and how corrupt they truly were. And I hate to say this in a positive light, because, granted, I don't see insane asylums as a positive light, but a lot of our current medications we use in the psychiatric world were developed because of the asylums. We look at, like, lithium. We look at clozapine, which is a huge schizophrenia medication. A lot of our medications came out of the asylums. And, that's the downfall, is a lot of some of our darkest history, there is a slight sliver of light in there. Is it a commendable light? I don't know. I'm not the one that's going to decide that.
Yeah. I feel like even the, like, words for it, like, insane, like, that is such a negative word to tell someone, like, you are insane. It's not usually used in a positive light. And then, like, asylum, it sounds like you're just kind of getting put there, it's not like you're going to a mental health hospital to get better, you go to the hospital to get better.
Right.
But an asylum, it's like, nope, you're there because you're crazy and you're not leaving.
You're stuck here forever.
Right. Like, just even the verbiage there is negative connotation.
Right. And that goes with a lot of, at that time, how negative mental health really was at that time. We look at some of the research that was done in psychology at that point, and oh man, we're not gonna go there today, but mental health really was its own issue, and there's a lot of negative things that come out of it that we still are trying to pick up the pieces from to this day. So when we look at the history of Native Americans, we often group them into one. The reality is there are hundreds of groups under the branch of Native American. Each group has its own unique culture, religious practices, cuisine, geographical location, and so much more. Here in South Dakota, there is currently 75,809 Native American individuals, which would be 8.6% of the population. And this consists of 9 unique groups, including the Cheyenne, Crow Creek Sioux, Flandreau Sante Sioux, Lower Brule, Oglala Sioux, Rosebud Sioux, Sisseton Wahpeton Iote, Standing Rock Sioux, and Yankton Sioux. I know a couple people from the Sisseton Wahpeton Iote, and I know a couple from the Oglala, and I know a couple from Rosebud. And they will tell you, they are very different. If you group them all together, they will get extremely mad at you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be like going to Norway and looking at someone and be like, oh, you're Swedish because you're white. And they'd be like, fuck you, man. I'm a Norwegian.
We also get offended when we get compared to, I don't know, North Dakotans.
That's true. That's true.
No one wants to be called a North Dakotan if you're from South Dakota.
And North Dakotans don't want to be called us.
You don't even want, if you're in South Dakota, this is kind of niche, but if you're in South Dakota, you don't even want to be called a West River person if you're from East River.
Yep.
Right.
There's distinctions.
Yeah. So the fact that they're trying, like, a lot of people try to just group these people together based on their skin color is ridiculous.
And a lot of them even have variations in skin color too.
Yes.
There's some more white presenting, there's more almost African American presenting. And then there's ones where they're more of course, our stereotypical native skin color. So that's where it gets really interesting, is even here in South Dakota we have the issue where we see them all as one, when truly they are not one. So often the reality is that much of the history of the atrocities done to Native Americans is either forgotten or brushed aside. I remember reading about the Trail of Tears and how much people say, like, oh, it's just the Trail of Tears. And it's like, it's the Trail of Tears. It was messed up. But this is apparent with the story of the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum, as many South Dakotans are not aware of the dark history of the only insane asylum specifically set aside for Native Americans. And I want to correct that because there was one right before it for the Cheyenne. It was expanded into the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum. So they were essentially the same entity, but the Cheyenne one was the origin of it. So the history and treatment of mental health has a continuous story of mistreatment, and oftentimes the reality is death. As you hear a lot of stories of the insane asylum of the day, a lot of people died at them. It wasn't a beautiful ending story. It was a tragic, terrible story.
Right, it kind of goes back to that negative, like, you're there to just live out the rest of your days. You're not there to get better. You're there to just, you're crazy. Get out of here, kind of thing.
Right. It just kind of reminds me of, like, American Horror Story, the second season Asylum. You look at that and it's messed up and you go, oh, that's a Hollywood edition. It's like some of that actually was pretty real. That was a lot of what people actually went through. I mean, I know my great-grandmother ended up at one of the asylums for a short while and had to get electroconvulsive therapy. And it's not a pretty picture. And so the history of the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum, or the Canton Asylum for Insane Indians, began in 1902 in the small town of Canton, South Dakota. And take note, it still is a small town. It became the second federally funded asylum in the United States. This location deemed itself important due to its mission to alleviate the struggle of the mentally struggling Indian. This is where I have problems because they still refer to them as Indians.
The misnaming of a group of people, but if that's what the location is called,
right,
it would be, from the historical side of it, for me, I found it's more offensive to people when you change the name to make it more, more politically correct, to call it the Native American Asylum, when on the building it was literally called that.
Right.
So
that's a good point, though. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's literally what that building was called, and it was what any facility was called at that time. But the reality is, it was a place wrapped in turmoil. Often for the Native Americans sent here, it was often due to their revolt against the colonial status quo, which required them to become indoctrinated into white culture and Christianity. When revolting, they were deemed insane. So this is kind of interesting, because in the insane asylums outside of Hiawatha, if you revolted against the system, if you were someone that didn't practice the religion at the time, you look at like the Salem witch trials. If you didn't follow the norm, oh, well, goodbye to you. And so this is, unfortunately, a common story throughout history here in the United States. One of my interesting findings is that the word insane is not found in Native languages, as each person is deemed as having a unique position within their community. Outside of this, some Native individuals were sent there for physical illnesses such as tuberculosis and epilepsy, and sadly some were even sent for refusing to have their children sent to the boarding schools, or even for arguing with the Indian agent that was present at their reservation. So I sit there and think about, I'm a mom myself, I'll have 2 kids. If my son was forced to go to a boarding school, you're darn tootin' I'm gonna fight someone. You ain't taking my babies away.
Darn tootin'.
Well, and it's not so much that a standard boarding school is a bad thing. It's you don't have a say in the matter. They're taking them. Like if you were actually going to a good boarding school, then if you chose that to be the option, they had the choice removed from them.
Right, and the reality is many of them were taken for years, and they were a completely different person when they returned.
Right.
Yeah, and if it's a nice boarding school, you're treated well, you're fed proper meals, you're treated like a human. At these other boarding schools that these Native Americans were being pushed to, they were not treated like humans, essentially. They were mistreated. It wasn't a good situation. It's, like you said, it's not the same boarding school people think of.
And the downfall is many children died at them. We're still facing the repercussions of it, where we're finding bodies of children at where these locations were and bringing them back. And it's, I mean, as a parent myself, and I can imagine anyone who's not a parent can relate to this, to that would be horrifying, not knowing where your child is going. You probably don't get to talk to them anymore, because back then, of course, you didn't have cell phones. Writing letters was a whole other ballpark of its own. And if it would be delivered, probably not. I guess I would have been in the asylum too, because I would have refused it.
Well, and you mentioned writing letters, and back then for like the natives, a written language was not all that prominent. Everything was an oral tradition. They didn't write things down. So writing letters to people really wasn't even an option, because they didn't have a written language.
Right. And some of them didn't want to write stuff down. It just was against their culture. Right.
And that's completely cultural. It's all just an oral tradition. You're told stories and, through their music and everything. And yeah, writing things was not a common thing to occur.
No, and that's part a lot of the interesting side with all that is how much their culture was eradicated with all of this. They all had these really beautiful cultures that we have some of it remaining, but not all of it. We've really taken away a lot of the beauty that was here. Now, when we look at the creation of this asylum, the founder was Richard F. Pettigrew, who at that time was a U.S. Senator. It is said that this idea came to him from an Indian reservation agent, and this idea was sold to him with the belief that there was not enough institutions for Native Americans. And it was believed that there could be 2 insane Indians on every reservation in the United States. One would hope that Senator Pettigrew had good intentions for that building, but unfortunately it was simply to grow the state more. At that time, South Dakota was really just beginning. We were part of there for the longest time. We were part of the Dakota Territory. And there was this belief that we really needed to expand South Dakota. We needed to catch up. And, I mean, we still need to catch up. We're still pretty far behind. The reality is he should have built it for the benefit of people, to help people. But even in that case, in my philosophy, my opinion is it shouldn't have existed. But in 1899, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was met with by Senator Pettigrew in order to receive funds to build this new asylum, which he decided to have built by Canton. The original numbers were found to have been 58 insane Indians, 6 idiotic Indians, and they were all on 21 reservations. Because of this, Pettigrew was awarded $45,000 in 1899. Do either one of you know what that would be in today's dollars? I want you to take a guess.
Oh, you actually have that?
I do have it.
So it was how much money?
$45,000.
At what, in what year?
1899.
I'm just sitting here like, wow, $45,000, that wouldn't pay for anything.
It's got to be, like, if it's not in the millions, it's got to be close to millions.
Okay.
Like, that's a lot.
$1.2 million,
Close.
my guess.
Close.
Oh, nice.
Higher.
$3.5 million.
Okay, 1 million range.
Well, you said higher. You said it 3 times.
One and a half.
Close, 1.4 million.
Oh.
So, like many other asylums of the day, the population present at this Canton location grew beyond what the location could handle, and in 1912 more funds were allocated. The downfall was state representatives, and you'll later going to learn about the great, and I say it very sarcastically, Harry Hummer, both often refused funds because they just didn't believe that the people there deserved. So, that's just absolutely fantastic of South Dakota.
Man, I love our history.
Just constantly finding ways to be disappointed. So the first individual ever brought to this location was from the Sante Sioux Reservation. Andrew Hedges, a 33-year-old Sioux man, unfortunately was the first person to be brought here on December 31st, 1902. When I was typing that, I thought for some reason that was Christmas, and now I feel kind of dumb.
What was the date again?
December 31st.
It was after Christmas. That's New Year's Eve.
Oh, bringing in the new year. Poor dude.
Not a fun way.
No, definitely not a fun way. By the completion of 1903, 16 individuals lived at this location. Some of the diagnoses of these individuals was alcoholic dementia, chronic mania, melancholia, congenital epileptic idiocy, and others. Interestingly, there wasn't psychiatric services right away at this. It actually took quite a few years.
Shocker.
Right? Who would have thought a mental asylum not having a psychiatrist? What? But interestingly, though, the psychiatrist that eventually did show up at this location often stated that he did not have time to take care of the medical needs of the patients at this location. Excuse me, Mr. ND.
What was he doing then?
I'll say he didn't have time to help the people at his facility?
No.
What was he
No,
doing?
what was he doing?
Well, they did end up getting medications, but he didn't believe that they needed appropriate care.
So he was just medicating them without... Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Sadly, the first death occurred not even 6 months into the opening of this location. Robert Brings Plenty, a 21-year-old Sioux man from the Pine Ridge Reservation, was deemed to have suffered an epileptic seizure that took his life in the middle of the night. After his death was notified to his home reservation, no request was submitted, and thus Robert was buried on the grounds. Robert would not only be the only individual to die at this location, as sadly within the 30 years of its run, over 120 individuals lost their life, often due to the mistreatment by staff. And this is a large number of people, so when you look back and see, there was around 350 people that were admitted to this facility. And 120, they don't know if it's the accurate number. They actually think the number is higher. So if you think about it, 120 out of 350 people in 30 years. That's a lot of people that died there.
That's literally about 50% of people.
It almost is. Like, that's sad. And that includes that there were children born here. And also died there. So... I look at that and go, wow, that shows that this place was not set up for good intentions for the people. Some of the staff at this location even reported the crimes and atrocities done to the individuals living there. Often when they would report these crimes, they were met with being fired. One individual, Cleto Tafoya, who petitioned against the sale of fake souvenirs at local trading posts, was placed into the asylum for paranoia. So... if you revolted, you might end up in there too. And the sad part is, talking about the fake souvenirs, a lot of the patients that lived there did create different artifacts while living there that were sold and they never benefited from it. But let me tell you who did. Harry Hummer.
Of course.
Of the people incarcerated, many here were without mental illness. Many were imprisoned at this location for petty crimes, alcoholism, developmental disabilities, tuberculosis, and various other reasons. And that the developmental disability part was the most interesting to me because a lot of times back in the early origins of mental health, because we're one of the newest branches of medicine is psychiatry. And in it, oftentimes developmental disabilities were grouped in with mental illness.
Yeah, people didn't understand the differences between those two.
No. I mean, there's still a lot of stigma where both are consolidated together.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's very distinct differences between them, and that's where, again, getting the message out there of what mental health is. Because they were admitted to this location, they were heavily medicated, which often induced seizures, hallucinations, and confusion. So one of the staff psychiatrists, so I had to do air quotes on that, who had no background in psychiatric care, often deemed many individuals as having mental illnesses simply because they were disengaged from the population. And when I say disengaged, they didn't speak English. They were away from their family. Think of it this way. So all three of us in here speak English.
Correct.
Take one of us, throw us into a deep part of Mexico.
Oh boy.
None of our family's there. We have no cell phone to call our family. And nobody there, let's just say in this area we're sent to, they all speak Spanish. Mm-hmm. There is no English. How are we going to feel?
Very alone.
Very alone. Are you going to sit there and be a happy campy?
Very confused.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I know a little bit of Spanish, but not enough to survive.
Right, and that's how they were too. They knew a little bit of English, but not enough to survive.
Right.
Yeah, like I've taken a little bit of German, and I could have like a short conversation with someone in German, but like if I was thrown out in small town Germany where they don't speak any English, that would be pretty rough. I wouldn't make it very far.
No, and that's just it with these folks is they were so disengaged and they were lonely, but then they were deemed with mental illness because they weren't happy-go-lucky about it. And you sit there, like, when we talked about this, you do feel lonely. How are you supposed to, we're a social creature. How are we supposed to communicate? And I mean, you think about it, yes, children learn very quickly about language. As adults, it's a lot harder. And a lot of these people were adults.
And it even goes back to what you said earlier in the episode where each different tribe of Native Americans have different cultures and such. Like, they all had different variations on their language as well. So even being with different tribes within this asylum, like, that doesn't mean you're going to have all these great social connections because you might all speak different dialects.
Right. And that is a lot of the problem. And there was that issue on the reservations. All these different tribal nations were brought in onto one area of land, and they didn't understand each other. Sometimes they might have been rivals beforehand. So like many of the other asylums throughout the United States, neglect, abuse, and death were rampant. Many of the staff were without training, and often they disciplined. And again, I put this in quotations, discipline. They took this and way overdid it. They would choke the patients there. They would beat them. They would kick them. There's even cases of sexual assault occurring where children were born out of it. And of course, they isolate the patients. Some patients were even reported to being chained to beds for days and even at times months. And they hadn't seen sunlight, got fresh air. They urinated over themselves. And it's removing the humanity from these people.
Absolutely. Treating them more like animals than anything.
Right. And even, I mean, Grant, my thought about that always is animals deserve good treatment, and that's where they were treated more like dirt.
Yeah, I was going to say, livestock would be treated better than that.
Right, and that's always what we refer to first is they were treated like animals, because we see treating humans as important, but in this case, they would have probably treated a rat in that facility better than they did the people there.
True.
But the patients were also essentially treated like prisoners, as not only were there no bathrooms in the rooms, and so this is the weird part, there were bathrooms in the facility, the patients were not allowed to use them. They were used as storage units. So they were given chamber pots, and the staff rarely changed them. And they also had windows that were barred up, so no fresh air and sunshine were allowed to the patients there. And although you actually look at pictures of the Canton Indian Insane Asylum, and you can see like a small playground out there. They weren't really allowed to use it. They were essentially stuck in their rooms. It is said that there was an investigation in 1925 that only one staff was available for 90 people. So, yeah, definitely not getting quality care.
No.
In fact, Harry Hummer refused to hire more staff after complaints were made, and the first licensed nurse was not hired until 1927. And ironically, there were no licensed psychiatrists for the first 8 years of this location's creation. So I keep bringing up Harry Hummer. So he was not the first. I guess I want to say the commander of this facility. He came in later on, and he's extremely corrupt, and you're going to learn that here soon. Not only was this location well understaffed, resources were minimal. In the years of its operation, 204 people were discharged, and only 35 were actually deemed as recovered. So if you guys hear that, 35 recovered. Where are the other people at?
I have no idea.
They're dead.
They're probably dead.
They were dead. So looking at that means they died, and that's really sad that only 35 recovered. And what do you think happened to those 35 that were released?
They were probably told never to talk about what they experienced there for sure.
Part of it. What do you think they did to them physically?
I don't want to think about it.
They sterilized them, and so they weren't allowed to procreate. Looking at this means that the remaining individuals, again, discharged due to death. Ironically, Harry Hummer, one of the superintendents of this location, would not allow family members to visit as he felt it harmed their treatment. But get this. If you were a paying person in the community, you were allowed to come in.
Of course. Anything for money.
Exactly. But, so that makes me wonder, if I was a paying family member, can I come in?
Probably not, but he'll still take your money.
Yeah, probably. And the reality is, a lot of Native Americans did not have money. They were horribly mistreated on the reservations. Although there was not so great staff, in 1909, 13 staff members filed suit against Hummer due to concerns with the mistreatment of patients. The report deemed Hummer as morally and financially above reproach. That was with the investigation, like, oh no, he's a swell guy. And the staff was like, this guy ain't good.
Wrongo you are.
Right. And later in 1914 and 1915, he was accused of misconduct against female workers there. Again, he was cleared of his crimes.
So these staff are doing the right thing. They're like, nope, this is not okay. But
right.
It's more of like the law.
Right. The law's like, you know what? Nah. And it's sad because I was reading some stories. So again, there wasn't psychiatric care there for 8 years. There also wasn't actual nurses there until around that time. And the few nurses that came in, he would target them. And he would make their life hell there because they tried to give good care to the patients there. And nope, he didn't believe in that. So, from this recollection, it's clear to see at some point Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum closed, just like all other asylums in the United States. So Dr. Silk completed an investigation in 1929 where he reported concerns of lack of employees, mistreatment of patients, excessive use of straitjackets and restraints, and many other reasons. Dr. Silk reported that there was no light inside of Hiawatha as Hummer refused to have electricity throughout the building, regardless of the many light fixtures, as well as concerns with no plumbing. Again, although there were bathrooms, they were used as storage rooms. So this facility was set up to have these necessities, but Hummer refused.
Right. It was, everything was put in place. Mm-hmm. He just chose not to use them or use them in the way they were intended to be used.
Right. He essentially, part of me kind of wonders if he got some joy out of the mistreatment of these people.
He probably did. It sounds like he kind of does.
Right.
Because if he was punishing staff for doing their job correctly, there has to be something going on. Sounds like he was the one that needed to be in an asylum.
Most definitely.
And get the mental help to not be like that.
He most definitely. This guy is messed up. I would say I'd throw hands with him, but he's probably dead.
You'd probably win then.
Good. I'll go fight his bones then. Silk deemed that the facility was far below the standards of the modern prison. So take some time to really think about that one.
Love that life for them. And I say that sarcastically.
When you think about the prison of that time, a lot of the prisons back during those times were more poverty prisons. And they were horribly mistreated. So that tells you that not a good place to be. And expressed disgust over the lack of medical care. Again, they had psychiatrists there. They had is the key word. They fired many of the nurses. And when it comes down to it, the lack of medical care was astounding. A lot of these people were forced into medications that just messed them up when they really had no mental illness. I mean, think of it this way. If I'm not diagnosed as schizophrenic, if you put me on clozapine, I'm probably going to go a little off my rocker. But in 1932, the new commissioner, John Collier, closed the facility due to reports done by Silk, family members, and various other individuals. So when Collier took over, a lot of family reached out to him and said, we haven't seen our family. They're being horribly mistreated. And he actually listened. So good job, my guy. You did better than Hummer.
Didn't take much.
That's true. That didn't take much.
Really, all he was doing was being a decent human being.
He's just going above Hummer.
The bar was buried under the ground, so as long as you just walk on the ground, you're going above that bar.
Exactly. But complaints were made that this closure would result in the loss of jobs. But regardless, it was closed by the approval of the federal court, which reasonably, so this place needed to go bye-bye. With this, 69 people were transferred to St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C. on December 21st, 1933, as well as 2 later on, and 16 were released. But tragically, most likely were sterilized before their release. Although this location was closed as an asylum, it was used as a penitentiary until 1946. This facility was later torn down, and now it's the home of a golf course. And so we actually went and toured this area, and to me, I'm going to sound dark saying this. It's kind of messed up that this huge memorial where a ton of people are buried is a golf course.
Yeah. I kind of thought that when we were there.
Bit. I thought it wasn't too bad at first because it was like, okay, the golf course is over here and this is where the buildings are. Mm-hmm. But then we walked over to that big plaque in the ground that has the names.
Right.
And it's fenced off around it. And there's signs by all the entrances saying no play, inside the fence. It's like, oh, this is like right on the golf course. Like I thought it was a little bit off of it and it just happened to be near it. It's like that's where it felt very uncomfortable to me. Just like, really?
Oh, it does. I mean, it'd be like taking here in Millbank, we got that large cemetery next to Unity Square, just taking all of them markers away and decide, let's expand Unity Square. Mm-hmm. To me, that'd be a little messed up. Yeah. Like, that just makes me uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. In other areas where there was something important like that, it's usually completely marked off, like there's a memorial there, but you can go visit it, but you can't, like, that's what museums and stuff are for,
Right.
Whereas this one, it shows complete disrespect that, we noticed that something awful happened here, and all we're going to do to pay our respect is put this plaque here, and we have some of the farm buildings still here.
And that's the sad part, because there is a restoration group that really wants to get the mission out there, get the stories told, and there's not a lot of funding.
Right.
And when it comes down to it too, I was reading this comment I was watching a couple of videos from Keloland about this location, and someone was playing devil's advocate, and I listened to it, and it kind of hit me somewhere deep. He's like, somewhere in history, new buildings are going to be moved in. Every place is going to be historical at some point. And he's like, and that's where it is a downfall. He's like, it's not easy to think about those things. Because he's like, at some point, we have built homes over burial grounds. We have torn down cemeteries and put facilities there. And
sometimes it's remembered when it's put up, and sometimes it's not remembered, and you have no idea that that's where that house is being built or that structure in general. So it's... Right. Yeah, everything is historical at a certain point in time.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, it's even the same, like, with the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. The apartment where he killed all those people, it was torn down, and now there's another building there. There's no memorial there for the people that he killed there. And it's sad to think, we want to have these memorials for people, but then it's also, we have to keep on living, too.
Eventually, not to sound morbid and very... desensitized to it, but eventually it would kind of turn into like you turn on YouTube or the news or whatever, and there's a bunch of ads everywhere.
Right.
You're just going to see plaques everywhere saying this happened here 200 years ago, this happened in the same place 50 years ago, all around us. And eventually it would just be too much.
Right. And that's where Mariah pointed out the museums. Those are so important because we can keep things there.
Right.
But that's where I think it's so important too, that if we can't have the plaques, really teach that history. Because the downfall is history does repeat itself. We see it time and time again. Look at the Nazi concentration camps. It wasn't the first time in history. We had the Japanese concentration camps here in the United States. There were many throughout the times in history. Russia, they had the Gulag. The downfall is if we don't teach that history, we're going to repeat it. or sometimes even if we teach the history, but we don't teach it to the value that it is, such as, like the example of this case, if we whitewash it and say, oh, it really wasn't that bad. It was bad.
It's like people trying to call them indentured servants. Like, no, they were slaves.
They were.
Like, that's... You're really trying, because that word has such a stigma to it. Like, oh, it has all these negative connotations. We'll just say this word instead. It's like, that's not what they were called, and that's not what they were. And
that takes away from the mistreatment that occurred to them. Makes them go, oh, it wasn't that bad. When it's like, it was bad. And when we really make it known that it was bad, we're less likely to continue it because there's shame that comes with it. And that's why it's important for this story to be repeated too, because the downfall is, again, not many know about this location. And there is still a lot of stigma around Native Americans. There's still a lot of stigma around a lot of groups. And that's where if we aren't willing to continue the story, we're just essentially allowing history to repeat itself. And that's where, again, we were talking about where this location was. So for anyone curious on where it's located, this is near the Fifth Hole. An area is fenced off along protection for the marker of 120 women, men, children, and infants who perished at this location. So when we were there, we noticed 2 standalone graves. And I did some research on this because I'm like, why is there only 2 graves there? There were technically graves for every one of those people. So the philosophy is either they were stolen, they were lost, or they sank into the ground. I would highly bet that a lot of them went missing, or because I can't imagine at that time when they closed it, a lot of people really gave 2 hoots. And that's the sad part is they were so mistreated that they weren't given proper burials. I mean, you look at it, the burying underground is more of a Christian ideal. It probably wasn't a Native American one.
Yeah.
And so you can still go and pay your respects to this day to this location. And again, like I said, I'm a little uncomfortable with it being a golf course. I was kind of nervous about us getting hit by a ball while we were out there.
We did not get hit by any golf balls.
We didn't.
While we were there.
We did not.
And in all fairness, like when we were there, because there were people playing golf, there wasn't anyone there being like actively disrespectful. Like they weren't like driving by one of the buildings and hitting it with a golf club or hitting, like people were giving it their a wide berth to avoid doing that, and they weren't harassing us for doing this, and we weren't harassing them for playing their game of golf.
No, and that's where I do want to talk really briefly about the buildings. The buildings that stand are not the original structures, but a lot of the building material is from the building. So there's been a lot of people that have visited the location and have reported paranormal activity. There's been a couple mediums that have gone there and have talked to quite a few of the spirits there. And I know when we went out there and used the spirit box, when we asked if they were treated well, we got the right away answer of no. And that's really sad to think about, because oftentimes with paranormal groups, there's an understanding that negative energy resides and it stays. And obviously this is not a place that good things happen. So a lot of the tragedy still remains. To kind of end this off, I want to share a story of one of the cases. So there were 7 children that were born at this location. Most of them were due to rape. And that's not uncommon with the insane asylums. It was very common for children to be born there due to rape. One of the cases was of a 10-year-old boy who was placed long-term in a straitjacket as he refused to wear the clothing required of him when placed in the facility. So again, he was Native American. He had his traditional clothing. He didn't want to wear the smock or whatever they had to wear there. And he was deemed harmless. He did not try to harm them. They said that he would spit randomly, but that's a typical boy thing. They spit.
And it might have been more of like a self-defense mechanism too at that point. Like, because if you think you're 10 years old, getting ripped away from your family and your life, you're going to be defiant at the age of 10. At any age, I think, honestly.
Oh, definitely.
If you're getting ripped away from what you know and being put in this strange place, you're going to be defiant.
Right. I think that, and that's where they just didn't want to deal with it.
No.
And I mean, it's so heartbreaking because for this kid, he was put in a straitjacket and he was left in it. And I said anything about my son's going to be 8. I can't imagine him in 2 years being ripped away from Jacob and I and thrown somewhere Because Grant Dexter's a pretty well-behaved kid. But I would imagine he'd be pretty defiant in that case. And rightfully so. And I can't imagine him sitting in a straitjacket. And that's the reality, is this was somebody's kid. And they probably didn't know that happened to him. And that's, again, these people were treated so far less than human. Now, with these children that were born at this location, many of them were without mental illness too, but Harry Hummer deemed them as insane and imbeciles. And he had them all sent to orphanages. They didn't get to say goodbye to their parents. Now, the very last thing I'm going to include, so a lot of people want to know about the records of Hiawatha, and it's really just recently been released, the few records that do exist. Unfortunately, records of this location are far and few between and scattered between agencies in many states. Although each person had to be authorized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it was admitted that the records were barely kept. Harry Hummer himself did not believe it was important to keep record of the patients either. So...
That's not surprising.
No, from what we've learned.
Yeah, from what we've learned over the course of this, that's just par for the course with him, it feels like.
And that's the sucky part, is we have to go back and go, oh, we had the story of the people, and it's like, how many of them could repeat their stories? They were so traumatized. And how much of them were willing, and a lot of them were sent to St. Mary, or St. Elizabeth's, I apologize. So a lot of their stories couldn't be said. There's the family members that remain, but the downfall is there's no written history there. We really only have what we have right now, and it's the more we get the message out there, the more that we can try to get that information back. And that's why the group that really promotes this constantly is trying to get the message out there, and that's hopefully it continues to grow, because even though this happened close back in the 1930s, that really wasn't that long ago. That was, almost 100 years ago? But we sit there and think about it. We look at the Titanic and go, what?
Was that really almost 100? Wow.
Yeah,
Was it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, time is going fast.
Mm-hmm.
I still think it's like the early 2000s some days.
Same. Well, and the weird part is we sit there and we look at the history of the Titanic, and we still think of it, oh, it wasn't that long ago. That happened in 1912. This occurred later than that. And we still don't have that much history. On the Titanic, we have tons of history on it. This, barely.
But look at the demographic that those people were affected. The Titanic was the wealthy white man,
mm-hmm.
and the Hiawatha Insane Asylum was the poor Native Americans.
That's a very valid point. And that's the reality, is it's not just Hiawatha, it's all of them. A lot of the asylums, there was not much for written history there. There was so much mistreatment. Hiawatha was torn down, but a lot of them remain. And that's where, will we ever know much about Hiawatha? Maybe, maybe not, but that's where it's important that we continue to keep talking about it. We get that story out there.
So history does not repeat itself.
Let's hope not. All right, well, thank you for joining us today and listening to this not so fun story. I'm sorry, but sometimes you have to hear the sad parts in order to learn. I'm going to pass it back on to Mariah to give us some of that social media content.
We love social media in today's world. I will be posting some of our videos from when we went and toured the Hiawatha Insane Asylum grounds. So if you want to check those out, make sure to tune into our TikTok at Midwest Spook-kast. And we'll have some of those posted here kind of leading up to release of this episode, maybe a little afterwards. So TikTok is at Midwest Spook-kast. We are on Facebook as Midwest Spook-kast. We are on the app X, formerly known as Twitter, as at Spook-kast, not Midwest Spook-kast. You can always send us an email with your spooky stories if you'd like to, and we'd be happy to share them here on the podcast. The email is midwestspookcast@gmail.com. And I believe that is all of our socials. Keep a lookout for our upcoming episodes. We appreciate you all so much for tuning in. We are at almost 200 views, which we think is amazing since we just started, 3 months ago?
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. So we appreciate you all. And we hope to keep growing and sharing the stories of our history and some of the spookiness around it. And we'll catch you next time. Stay spooky, ghoul friends.